moment and realize what you just said. As I greeted you, they could have just been the words out of the mouth of another priest or a rabbi or anybody in a religious community who would invite us to acknowledge something about ourselves. But I think as I listen to you, Josh, and hear you, Kate, come alive in your own way, this is one of those times we can take a deep breath and realize that someone has said to me, now do I believe that the Lord is with me? And then do we offer back to each other that acknowledgement also with you? And think about how many times we might say that in a church setting. Now, hey, you know what? Here we are. We're church today. Yeah? We come from different traditions, different backgrounds, but there's a great acknowledgement, which means a word I used to play with, and I still do sometimes, acknowledgement, to know again, recognize who we really are. And I'd like to just say a little bit about that, and then in a little while we'll move into some conversation in smaller groups, and then take a break and resume, come back here for Eucharist, and in that context be able to share some of what might be in the whole group. So there are different ways and times of sharing, but here we are. This really is it. The words that are going to come from our mouths, if it works out with the church's instruction as we move into celebrating Eucharist in a different way with next Advent, was the presider will say, the Lord be with you, and you'll be saying, and with your spirit. I personally like the and also with you, but with your spirit emphasizes the deep sense, too, of spiritus, of an indwelling breath that we were taken into when we were invited into meditation today. It's a recognition of someone abiding within us, which is what our more vernacular phrase asks us to know right now. I mean, you don't need anything to know that. Or we would say we really need all of this to know that. We need each other's help to know that. We need the breath of God in our midst to know that. And that's what we have from the Hebrew, ruach, the creating spirit of God that moved over creation, is absolutely in and among and upon us today. And the beautiful thing is, we hear in that reading that you and I are the ones who receive that spirit, and then we're living stones. We need to build up, we've been gifted to build up the world and the church, or whatever our dwelling is with God in the world. You know, where we live, we can make a difference. Why? Because, and also with you, we're saying to each other today, oh, thank you for telling me I have breath, the breath of life in me, that God's spirit abides in me. And by the way, I want to let you know that too. Let me breathe back that peace. Let me share it with you. From another tradition, and you might have the habit of simply saying namaste. It's a beautiful one. When we stand before each other in a simple bow, I recognize the indwelling of the One, the Holy One in you. I see and sense and acknowledge before you, within you. Now, what is it that helps us do that? The reading that we prayed together, that Josh took us into, the praises of God by Francis, came after a time he was with the Sultan. We've heard recently about Egypt and what's going on there. I wrote about it in our newsletter. We think it's an outbreak of freedom. We say it's very tenuous. We'd say, what is going on there today? Is freedom really emerging? And we'd say, well, that's the question in the room today. Now, this is an Egyptian experience, we might say. And now you don't know you're young, but you are. Okay. I mean, some of us know we're young. I mean, I know I'm young. Do you know you're young? Some look younger than others around here. Egypt is one of our most ancient cultures, and youth movements, the youngness among some of the young and others, are calling into a new day, a new time. We might say it's tenuous. Well, what about your life isn't tenuous? Yeah. What about my life at times isn't on edge? Radically needs what we're doing here with each other in the room today. Actually cries out and asks Kristen to turn off her cell phone. And it's lovely music, Kristen, okay? And we set that up, actually. That was recorded in Egypt. It's played for us here.
I hope you'll call him back.
It was my mother.
Well, she's in the room then, too. You know, isn't it wonderful to realize that all of our traditions would invite us to know whether it's shalom, salam, namaste, the peace of the Lord be with you. They would ask us that we would go around acknowledging that, smiling upon each other. Maybe it's where we see Asian people who simply bow. We've watched it in Japan, acknowledgement, seeking reconciliation, reverencing the people who have been overwhelmed, taking within their midst simple human bodily gestures as we are in a circle today, saying we're together in this. And there's one who abides here in each of us and in the world, who is our peace and power to be here. So just three operative words that I offer you today that are at the heart of what we're doing. And for me, the biggest one and largest one is where Josh was taking us in this beautiful thing to ask us to know we're the children of God. And that's where Peter is in this reading. You know, Peter's, you know, excuse me, just to step back, the praises of God of Francis emanated from his visit to Egypt. He was with the Sultan there and came home and wrote this prayer. So historically we know that as he went there, he came back here where he was with his sisters and brother. He climbed up a hill and he anguished over what was going on there. There was a crusades going on. There was violence between people. But he had an encounter of reverence with the Sultan. He had an experience of another culture, we would say, in our world today. He went there and he said, you know, I'd be just as happy if my head got chopped off because I want to preach Jesus to the world. Well, it's a wonderful line. It could sound terribly fundamentalistic, or we could say it's very fundamental and simple, not simplistic. And then he met another person who said, and I'd like to share with you my tradition. Now, we don't have their word language, but we know their presence with one another was of great reverence, and that they brought each other into a deep sense of peace, and I would guess, from what I understand, anguish for both of their peoples. So in this little room today, we bring in all sorts of personal histories and cultures and places and backgrounds. And we sit in this circle believing that there's one who's gathered us here. You know, our own language systems. Even if we're Catholic, we'd say, well, a lot of us are Catholic, and I'd say, you just don't see God the way I do. Why? Because you see God through your eyes and not with your heart. Say common faith, I say yes. More and more grounded with many in the world. Of the outbreak of God's abiding presence. Named in different traditions, and we're so blessed to name it in a way in which is not exclusive today, but inclusive of others when we say the Lord be with you. When we say I am a child of God. And in recognizing that, little operative words for us today, we have hope. We have hope. And St. Paul tells us hope does not disappoint. He also tells us you don't hope in what you see. So, I mean, you're a beautiful group of people, but I want to let you know I do believe in you, I hope in you, but I hope in others as well. You know? I'm not seeing the rest of the world today, but I am in some ways through you. But I want to be honest, you know, I see Jesus in this way I come, or I see the Christ, or I see a God I can't see by being like this, and I want to see that God happening. I hope in the fact that you and I can transform the world. It isn't transformed yet. I'm not even. I'm a work in progress. Sometimes I don't believe in that, but I believe a transformational moment is happening here with us today, and it's the outbreak of the Spirit, and it manifests itself in hope when, like St. Paul says, we begin to hope in things we don't see about ourselves yet. I can say I'm a child of God. I don't always see that. And I heard you, thanks Josh, tell us your own recent history. And I think you say, well, for a young student, neat guy like this, he's got the world together. And I believe you do. But every once in a while, our world may not seem together. Our faith may not be fully what we feel we need. We can feel our life is tenuous, and this is where we're called to hope. And moving in that, the recognition of grace, that grace is in our life. In our tradition, we're filled with the sense that God has come among us and sent us into the world. And further than that, we emanated from a God who wanted the world. Wanted the world because God is good, and God wanted the world to show up as a shining reality, the glory of God in us, in the world. And lo and behold, gave each other and the rest of the world to keep that image, that reality, that life going. And that's grace. Grace moves in us. It is God's abiding presence, we might say. And it's not like sitting here like this candle that we would say is immobile. Well, that flame, it flickers, it's lively. It's moving. That's why we have lights, not just these lights, which are wonderful, but we call them fixtures. That isn't fixed. It was lit. It's moving. There has a flicker. We waver, but we are bright here today. We are grace, vulnerable but present. And we hope in a great future, not only for ourselves, for each other. So with grace and hope, we can lend to each other the other simple word, and then we'll take a pause, and Chris will help us move into some groups for conversation, discussion, reflection. But we're a great encouragement. Paul tells us that, to be an encouragement to each other. And you say, well, why? Well, because life is not easy. You know, I mean, that may surface in a remark in a small group. It may not. In those settings, we're going to be very reverent, listen to each other. This is primarily a time of listening, but you know, even though you're doing a great job at it right now, it's not listening to me. It's listening to the Spirit among us. The reason why we begin and introduce ourselves in each of our voices. And then we take encouragement for that, and it's a great old word. And it comes out of the French, which means from within our hearts. and courage and core from the very heart of who we are. So it's not facile words we're saying here today, though they may seem easy, and they're certainly with brightness and light and simple words, but we're encouraging each other to have the hope that there is grace in our world so that we can transform it as we are transformed by experiences like this deep sense of courage. And within all of that, you know, and maybe you're that way. I know I grew up in a family, so I'll name my sister Ellen our background a little bit. We had a mom and dad who just, and were imaginable. They imagined life. I mean, I bet all of us look back and say, I don't know how we got through all that, you know? Or where did they, you know, we were 5 kids and they ended up, only in my later adult life did I realize, gee, my dad worked 2 jobs, my mom was working 2 jobs. We just lived in a home where there was a lot of love and care. And we were the best thing in the world because we had Hellman's mayonnaise and Land O'Lakes butter. You know, I mean, that was the top of the pile. And Peter Pan peanut butter. Thank you. I mean, this was it. You know, and I thought, wasn't it fun to make jams and jellies? And wasn't it great to, you know, can things and put all this stuff up in a cellar downstairs? And wasn't it great to have scrambled eggs on Saturday night? You know, and didn't know any of that was saving money. I knew it was finding and forming family. We encouraged each other. We helped each other imagine a way of living when there seemed like not being a lot. And I mean, here we are in a world where there isn't a lot, it seems. But there's more than enough to go around when we bring each other into a circle like this and feel the grace of God's presence moving among us, when we know the Lord is with us. And we begin to have a common hope that encourages each other to do what we can. Do what we can. We're here today. We're not in China. You know, many of us in our hearts today would want to maybe be in Japan. Maybe you have a great sense of being somewhere else. Kevin works with the Vice President. I'm not sure where he is today, but I'm glad you're here. Pardon me? Delaware, so that allows you to be here, huh? Yeah, if he were off in another part of the world, you'd be wandering there too. So, I mean, you know, we'd say, who do we walk with? Now, we're walking with everybody here today. We brought the world into our midst by bringing each other into each other's company. And as Josh did, I would just lend back to you that ancient phrase from us as well. As we heard ourselves say, I'm a child of God. You know, take a deep breath right now. Sense the grace of the Spirit, Ruach, creating Spirit of God among us. The invitation to bow before each other today in some recognition of an abiding God. To know Francis went among other cultures, and we do too. Seeking to greet no others with shalom, salam, paz, pax. And then as we, in a few moments, we'll go into smaller groups, really hear deep within our hearts, not only for me, but from within each other. A simple expression that we might all respond to again. As I say here in our midst for all of us, and as we say in the midst of the world for the whole world, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.